Hello, adventurers, and welcome back to another exciting episode of the Zulu's RPG stream. I got it right this time, despite the fact that I am somewhat sleep deprived. I was absent for a little bit because we have a brand new player has entered the world. She screams a lot and demands my attention on a regular basis, but that's not what we're here for. What we're here to talk to you about today is more D&D stuff. I've gotten ahead of myself. Very sorry about that. I'm Rob. I'm one of the DMs at Zulu's Board Game Cafe, and I am joined, of course, by Jason and Alex. How are you guys doing today?
Having a great day. It's going good so far.
Delightful.
Yeah, I'm doing all right. I don't have any new players yelling at me though.
Nope.
Yes.
That makes it a little easier.
Yeah, it does make life easier.
It's true. So for your guys, I had an interesting question that happened before I was waylaid by having a kid. And it was one that I was looking forward to talking about because I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys on some solutions for these particular problems. I love these being able to bring problems to you guys and have you help me sort of figure it out. So the problem in this particular case is railroading. Now, for those of you who don't know, railroading is when a dungeon master sort of removes the agency from the players and sort of takes them along a rail or track, making it so they can't really make decisions in a particular scenario. The easiest way to think of this is if you've ever played a video game and you've been going along, playing, having a good time, and then something happens that you're like, now if I had control, I could have stopped that. It's usually a cutscene is where that happens. So I guess let's go ahead and start with some examples. Jason, have you ever had a DM that has railroaded you in a particular game?
Yes. Had it happen a couple times, but one of the ones that stands out the most that really reinforced the I never want to do that is the example of the pet NPC. The NPC that the DM really identifies with, and so nothing bad can happen to them. This was to allude. It was one thing to you go to kill the king. Obviously you're going to end up with a bunch of angry people, and it's probably not likely to happen.
Well, and he's got guards. He's the king.
Yeah, but in the instance of if you simply want to give an insult and make them look dumb, and they just make sure that never happens because that character can never look uncool or that kind of thing. So you never really get a chance. There's all of the important NPCs are kind of off limits. They're status quo. They never change. But in the specific example, I was trying to do a stealthy thing of it was in the game Vampire the Masquerade, and I had a Tremere, and one of the things that I had a ritual where I could kind of put things out, and I was a con man. So I wasn't. This was not this was a guy who owned a bar. It wasn't even big NPC type thing, and I just wanted him to touch something, and so I was basically set up this whole elaborate ruse to get him to touch an object, and he just went, no, he sees through it and he attacks you. That kind, and that's the moment where you didn't even make a roll. You didn't, it's one thing to be I'm not playing your game, then fine. I'll find another way to do this. And even then it wouldn't have even given me power or anything like that. It was purely that aha, I got one on you kind of thing. And that's what I was going for. But that was really frustrating. And to the point of my character was then attacked by this character and forced, was restrained and held upside down, and I could do nothing to stop it. No die rolls, no nothing. It was some extreme railroading.
Yeah.
And then, forced to do a mission for the guy. Yeah, I didn't play after that. I was done with that particular DM, which is something to consider if you're really not having fun. You don't have to keep playing. We've mentioned it before, but yeah.
Yeah,
that's my egregious example.
And I'll be honest, that this is part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I feel like a really easy way to sort of suck the fun out of an encounter is when your character loses that agency, and that oftentimes can be when a dungeon master or game master will sort of force your hand in a situation. Alex, do you have an example of a time that you had to deal with railroading as a player?
Let's see. As a player, I'm not 100% certain. I know I've had some DMs that were that are still pretty chill, and they don't really do too much railroading. Sure, they do certain cutscenes, However, like they just make sure, like the DMs I've experienced have just made sure, oh, this cutscene does have an objective, so that you can be able to, so that you can start your quest or start your mission.
Yeah.
I know I had one experience where I was like this ranger, rough and rough wild man going to this fancy pants party, and then the cutscene, essentially there were like some orcs that were showing up, and they threw this magical spear and had really injured the wizard that was at the party, and then and the like one of the creatures got away or something. There was some crazy alien creatures and whatnot that we had to try and figure out as well.
Okay. So we mentioned cutscenes a couple times. We actually have notes for this one, so I'm immediately looking at them. You mentioned cutscenes a couple times, and I think so. Kind of as a dungeon master, to keep an eye, some of the things to keep an eye out from, because I mean, I feel like it's much harder for me anyway to be like, this was a time that I railroaded the players. Because I mean, I don't think as for the most part as a DM that's something that you try to do. I feel like that's something that will happen on occasion. So one of the things that I think to look out for as a dungeon master is if you notice that you find yourself kind of putting players into these sort of cutscenes, and we talked about that a little bit before. And I'm going to circle back around to that because I have something that I've been realized that I've had some troubles with, but that's okay. The other thing to remember as a dungeon master is any item or poison or anything that you give to an enemy has a very high potential of ending up in your player's hands at such a point as that creature dies or NPC dies. An example I heard recently, and this was kind of what got this whole thing started, was the players were attacked by an NPC with this massively powerful poison that that ended up taking away their magic, which I thought was a very odd thing that happened. And essentially, while they were incapacitated by this poison, they swooped in and stole all of their gold and items, which is rough, but it's even more rough when you learn that this was just at the end of the Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which is a whole campaign where literally what you're doing is you spend a whole chunk from level 1 to 5 getting massive amounts of gold, and at the end of it they're finally like, yes, we have all of this treasure, and it's all gone. Which it's a dirty sort of thing, and that's sort of a dirty thing to begin with. But they managed to move on with it because he's apparently a relatively new dungeon master. But then when they tried to do some research on the poison, because they had happened to have found a poisoner that was one of their NPCs they'd interacted with, they were like, no, you can't have this poison. Which was just such a brutal thing to have happen. And what's interesting was, so my immediate thought, because we're talking a lot about a lot of bad things. Let's talk about some solutions, specifically in this example, because as soon as I was hearing this, I was like, ooh, this is fun stuff. So firstly, the dealing with the money situation, that one's brutal. But
just be careful. Maybe. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, as I say, it's all money that's been embezzled by the city. So you can have literally the entirety of Waterdeep being like, no, you can't have all of that. You can have a finder's fee, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. There's also 3 other factions that they didn't directly deal with that are also looking for the money for a variety of reasons. So then you can introduce them as, like, turn that money into a burden. Every time they go to try and spend it, if it's large, lavish amounts, then things are going sort of pear-shaped. Or even nothing else. Give them the opportunity to defend against this gold stealing, and just the knowledge of knowing that someone's going to try and steal their massive hoard of cash will make them act in specific ways.
Yeah, and just make it like a tangible thing that, don't necessarily just steal it right away just because you can steal it because you're the DM, but more like just kind of make it an objective, like, hey, you want to make sure that you protect this somehow. I know one thing that I kind of ended up doing a little bit was I had my players in a certain area of the world, and they were in a certain area of like a homebrew world of mine. And so they ended up getting a ton of money. And then I was just like, oh no, they have cartoon amounts of money. So when they went to the next nation over, the nation was just like, oh, you have that money. I mean, we'll accept it, but not for as much.
Well, and one of the other things is like you can like in the instance of like money is a very specific thing, and like you can have that whole end of the Hobbit Battle of Five Armies once that horde is revealed. Like there's a lot of people going for it, like you said, Rob. I do like that. The other option is because I've also run into people like DMs stealing magic items because they realize it's too good. Now, or whatever it is, or want to set it to ground zero again, or whatever it is. But anytime you take something from a player, you need to give them a chance, for the most part, to get it back, unless that is a choice of the characters. That's kind of, yes, but like you mentioned, the wanting the poison. Like they could find the person who made the poison, but you can yes, but it to yes, but to get the stuff, you're going to have to go get this mushroom from.
Jason, you took the very idea out of my noodle. We're on the same wavelength, because that was my first thought too. When I was like, okay, this poison is massively powerful. Two fun things for it. Firstly, if there's that massively powerful a poison, who used it? Why'd they use it? What sort of faction have you introduced? Because now you've created a villain that the players are going to gun for hard. Like they're going to try and destroy this person because they took their stuff. Secondly, my first thought when I heard about this magical, mystical poison that removes your magic was, oh, they should be able to go on a quest to make it. Because, like, that's... And firstly, obviously, they have to go to all these places to get these ingredients, and, like, to make it, it must be under the moonlight in this one thing, and there are factions that know about this, so they're going to try and also use this ancient ritual spot to make the same poison, so they're having to fight for this this sort of bowl that this ancient dragon's heart was once held in, and so the magic is seeped into the very stone, and when the stars align, it brings out the magic, and if you put these certain poisons, like that's such a fun and interesting quest to go on to make this poison that like you're like, I know what this poison does. And even once they get this massive poison, if they do manage to get this massive poison, now other people know that they have it. And that, again, it's that same thing of like, now they're being hunted because they have this very powerful thing.
It's a whole cog in the machine sort of thing. It's a whole bunch of background knowledge that's happening, but like you can always like spring it upon your players.
Yeah, or it's a recipe that's separated amongst 10 hidden assassins. And you've got to get one of them to tell you that part of it or whatever it is. But there's always, I think also when you're doing those long, you give the players a choice to go on that quest for it.
Yes.
Because if they're not interested, that's a long slog and can be railroading on its own. Yeah. I think the more abstract you make the things, probably the better as a DM. That's one of the things to like kind of avoid railroading. So you can kind of, the more you make it X and Y is required, you have to slay the king and you have to do this. If there's no way around it or no, I don't want to do that. You can have repercussions for not doing it. Yeah. That's fine. It's because like I like giving the choice of like, so if you have a villain, like they have the choice of going after the villain, but if they don't, that villain's going to amass an army and that's going to eventually, destroy the whole homeland or something. Yeah.
Well, that was one of the other things I was thinking about was, as a DM, you have to be conscious of you're not creating sort of final solutions. What you're creating is interesting scenarios that the players then get to create that solution to. If you want to make awesome scenes and awesome solutions and run the whole narrative, that's called writing. You write a book, write a short story. That's exactly what you're doing. But DMing is and running games is very much a collaborative sort of activity. So as a dungeon master, as you're preparing your sessions, try to not think as much about like sort of destinations and more sort of interesting starting points, and trust the players will give you interesting destinations to go to. Going back to that the idea of like the kill the king and the do the thing and the other thing, like, understand that sometimes the players aren't going to want to kill the king. And if you have this whole elaborate plan that hinges on a single thing happening, that plan may not happen. And honestly, it feels really, really good as a player to feel like you're like, haha, I found the way to defeat this thing. I found this linchpin. And as a DM, like, I like to reward that feeling of just like, I figured it out. And that's honestly why a lot of times I use Bard's Tongue, is because I like to make the players feel smart. Just today I had a session where I was like, I wanted to have a spider basement. So they're traveling, so they end up in this cabin. They go into the cellar. It's filled with spider webs. So like, are there any signs of drow? And I was like, well, there are now.
Oh boy.
And that became its own sort of like opportunity for other things. So yeah.
Yeah, I know. For me, wait, where was I going with this? Oh shoot, maybe I don't know actually. I know, like, so. No, I remember. Brain working.
Yeah.
So I know for me, I like to plan and kind of have like a general idea. Like, okay, I like to run a super open world, so like the players can choose where they would like to go, and then there will be something that happens when they walk into that area or not. So I know for some of my groups, I've got like okay, so I've got a general idea, literally what on earth could happen that could kind of make like this. Okay, this is a general idea. They are going to they're planning on meeting an NPC. NPC will give them a mission. Great. And then the very next session, they're like, yeah, so we're just gonna go do this thing that's not anything that you planned for at all whatsoever. Like, I'm like, but I've planned like the base of a house. And they're like, yeah, but we're gonna go onto the roof of another.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things to realize as a dungeon master is, just because you have spent all this time making this thing that you very much enjoy, it doesn't mean that you need to force your players there. Now, you can artfully squeeze them into situations. For instance, I had a fight that I'd planned. I was like, all right, they're gonna deal with this archer who has a cloaker on their back. They're gonna throw it at them. There's some little NPCs that'll attack. It'll be a whole thing. They're like, we're gonna go talk to him, and I'm like, okay. So they have a conversation. I was like, here's a plan. We'll convince them to take the cloaker without knowing it's a cloak, and then later when they camp, it'll then ambush them and then attack them. So I still got to use that same fight, that same ambush, all that stuff. It's just the circumstances of it were slightly different. In that particular case, it made sense. Like, it made sense that these guys would continue hunting them, and I could have the fight elsewhere. But like in the example of we've got the base floor of one house and they want the roof of the other one, you can't be like, and then you fall through the floor. You could, but again, it runs into that situation where kind of massaging players into a specific direction and forcing them into a different direction, I think, are two different things. And riding that line can sometimes be a little bit messy.
Yeah. Also, being adaptable is huge. So, like, if the players you want the players, you're hoping, you need them to talk to the local smith, and they really want to go to the bar. You can have them go to the bar, have them have fun, and they realize that the smith is drunk at the end of the bar, and then he can he's there, the drunk, or not drunk or whatever, or he comes looking for the players if that's the case. Whatever, that's. You are adapting to what the players want to do, and whatever they want to do in the bar. Maybe they just want to get to drink and have fun, and just throw that little bit of exposition on the side. I also think it's important to think of your NPCs more as characters in the same world as the players, and not plot points. Because that's where you can really run into some railroading, where you're just like, they exist for this reason. Whereas you'll have them make suboptimal choices when you're thinking of them as characters. And that can be very interesting. So the players can outthink them. Whereas if they're a plot point and you just want them to regurgitate that thing, and he's going to be the one that gives them the treasure at the end, well, he's going to have to stay alive, right? Yeah. So you keep kind of manipulating things to forcing it into that kind of shape.
I have so many murder hobo players where I'm like, okay, here's an important NPC that he could just kind of show up, and then they're like, I'm gonna kill him. And I'm like, okay, fine, roll to hit. And then they're like, sweet, I natural 20, and I'm just like, okay, of course you get a natural 20. So then I'm just like, okay, cool. So you guys are now known as murderers throughout the land.
Yeah. It's a big one too. The other thing is, once they keep pulling that trick, NPCs will become wise to the tricks that they do, and so you can start setting up NPCs that like that purposely have some spells ready, or a magic item that'll protect them from that type of thing as they come at them. Of course, magic items. I think spells will work better typically because magic items can encourage murder hobos.
Yep, it's that same thing of anything that the NPC is holding is just one murder away from the players now holding it.
Yeah, a potion is also great because because it's a consumable and they're used it. And so if they can get out of there with gaseous form, it's just
I'm just imagining like just this mailman is coming by and he's like, "Hey, I've got a letter for you," and then the murder hobos do their thing, and then he just falls and drops like the message, and it's just like a important like, "Hey, here's your quest."
So actually, you brought up an interesting thing with the gaseous form, which the 10 feet for gaseous form makes it brutally difficult to run away with that one because they can basically run circles around the fart cloud as it tries desperately to hover away. But one of the things that I've really enjoyed is turning a fight into a chase scene, where I'm like, I've constructed this fight, I've gotten it all kind of figured out, and then the thing starts, and there's like 3 nat 20s, and they outsmart me with something, and I'm like, wow, they have decimated this fight. I'm like, all right, so now the NPCs are afraid, and they're going to try and run. So what can I do to try and get the NPCs away? With the understanding that it's a very high chance that they'll probably won't. And that's always the very kind of interesting thing is accepting that you ultimately, even though you are the DM, you are this sort of the bringer of the story, like you don't always get to choose what the outcome is. Like sometimes you're clever. Turns out, what is it? Minor illusion is a semantic, which means that if you have greater invisibility, you can use minor illusion to create a sound of yourself over there, so that even though you're only moving at 25 feet, the fireball will not kill you because you've moved in the opposite direction of the sound, and they'll blast something else away. So that becomes then an interesting sort of thing for you to sort of come up with a fun sort of scenario. But again, with the understanding that they might be like, you know what, I'm gonna use Wish to cast Locate Creature, and he's right there, and then I fireball him to death.
Yeah,
that might happen.
Yeah,
this was a level 20 campaign in particular. That's 20, a very niche sort of specific spot.
Completely off the rails. You can't know what's going to happen next. But yeah, I mean, like I like, it's other things to think about is to think of strategies in your head, not just like winning strategies, but losing ones, like you mentioned, running away. I had an encounter that took place in an alley where the player characters were getting mugged because they kept flaunting their wealth, and the local thieves guild had sent these people, but they were decimating them, and I'm like, they're not going to stick around for this. Once you kill a couple of them, they're like, nah, not worth it, and so they're running, and the players of course started chasing them. So I just had them kick over a bunch of the garbage in the alley and light it on fire. So there was a wall of fire. And so
literal dumpster fire as a defense mechanism. I like it.
Yeah, just to cover your escape, because they didn't care. And then there was innocent people being burned, and they had a choice of going after after the Thieves Guild, or help a screaming child.
So one of the things that, going back to cutscenes to come back around for a moment, one of the things that I run into sometimes is, and I think, Jason, you had mentioned before as we were talking, the analysis paralysis, and we'll get to that in a moment, but I sometimes have the opposite, where halfway through a description of an area, they immediately are like, I do this, I do that, I do this. And I'm like, you're going to need to let me finish describing a situation. But at the same time, the opposite can sometimes be true, where you find yourself getting to this role of describing things and describing things and describing things, and you don't bother to stop to be like, hey, did you want to do anything? What with all of this happening? Because some people are polite enough that they'll wait to let you finish talking before they'll interject. And so I've definitely run into kind of both sides of that, where like on the one hand, people are like, I get halfway through a room description and I'm about to explain that on the other. So like, you enter into a room, water drips from the walls. Like, I want to test the water for poison or stuff or things. I'm like, there's a dragon literally on the other side of this room. You're going to probably want to deal with the dragon before you go licking the walls. So give me a sec. But at the same time, also, if I describe this room has the walls, water dripping from the sides. On the other side breathes a dragon. Its heavy breath causing the room to heat. As it happens, the humidity causing your face to begin to sweat. The dragon stands and begins stalking forward. Like, some players might be like, oh, shoot, I'm going to cast this spell on myself. And, like, that'd be a great thing to do. But if I let myself get into that role, I'll sort of, like, drag them along. And then they won't have a chance to do something in response to what they're seeing.
Yeah, I've actually let players go off half-cocked like that, where like, so they've learned, like, where they do the I'm gonna check the thing for poison, and like I'm like, all right, so while you're doing that, the rest of you see,
yeah,
and they're like what?
Oh, man.
So their first round of combat is spent rolling to detect, to
lick a wall.
Yeah,
I like that analogy. I'm gonna lick a wall.
I mean, how else do you tell if it's poison or not? You do the whole like,
Nope.
That's poison. So yeah, like I said, we were talking before about analysis paralysis, which is something that can be very real, where on occasion, and Alex, you were also talking about having an open world, and sometimes, like, you can run into the problem where by giving your players this whole big open a world, they suddenly become sort of overwhelmed with the possibilities of things to do. So oddly enough, on occasion, sort of reducing the number of decisions that players can make can sometimes make it easier for them to actually do that. And Jason, do you have an example of how you would use gentle railroading, we'll call it?
Yeah, so well, even I've had groups where they get or you explain the room, like there's frozen corpses and there's a spear sticking out of one of them, and there's snow built up on the side of the room as the walls have collapsed in from the weight of all of this snow. And you describe there's a barrel in one corner of the room that's curiously untouched, and you can see platinum pieces underneath the weight of the snow. What do you do? And that's real specific. And there's a bunch of things. I get it. There's a lot of choices. You kind of have to think it through. But some players will just go wait for somebody else to say what they're going to do before they go. I think that's the case that I run into. It's also different over Zoom. Because you're not always seeing faces and stuff.
Yeah.
But that's not usually the problem. But that was my I've had that issue. Because right there, you're very curious. What happened here? That's what I'm hoping you run into with, like, oh, what's going on?
Now, does the barrel have no snow on it?
No, it has no snow on it.
Oh, that's something interesting.
Does the snow come up to the sides and then stop? How much of a gap between the snow and the barrel do we have?
I actually was using a miniature thing, so the snow had not quite gotten to that portion.
Okay. You intrigued the heck out of me. I was excited for this room.
Oh yeah, there is a puzzle in there, and it ended up with one of the person before they died scrawled out on the stone floor a word. But yes.
That's always a helpful
classic
thing.
Like, it was, here, let's see if you can figure out what to do. But yeah, but also, like, the same thing have had happen where you can be like, all right, there's this big open room, there's 3 doors, what do you want to do? Do you want to check out the doors? Like, they're too far from you to see what they are, so you need to go over there and walk to them and check out. You describe the room. There's a carpet or something on the floor, and then it's just that kind of. It can be, I don't know what I want to do, or they even get to the 3 doors and just like, I'm not even going to take a chance. I'm just going to stare at these doors until something happens.
Till the door opens up.
Yeah,
you need to use your knowledge of what's behind the doors to your advantage. If there's a living creature in there, does it make a noise? Does it smell them or sense them and start trying to come? If there's an ooze under there, is it going to start coming under the door because it sensed their presence? Hopefully you've set it up. If you know your players, you're not going to hopefully, put them in that situation. If they're the types that do that, you're going to have to give them a chance. Like, you hear something rattling against the door, you're going to open it or take one of the other doors, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or, and obviously if you have people who really can't choose, you only have 2.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, and I think that, oh, sorry. What were you saying, Alex?
Oh, well, I was also going to say, so I also have an example of just like helping the players like start to choose with one group in particular. I accidentally gave them like a lot of quests for them to choose, and they were also coming up with quests for their characters. Like they wanted to work on some character development, and I had already kind of given them like, oh hey, you could go do this thing, and then like, but that was kind of like, hey, this lady is saying, can you do this thing? And so like I had seen that they were all just like, oh my gosh, we've got like 12 different things to do at once, and I'm like, okay, so there's this other force that's going to take care of that thing, so you don't have to worry about it. What do you want to character develop? And they're like, oh, thank goodness the knights in shining armor are going to go fight the other army. It's fine.
Yeah.
So they're still trying to figure out what they're doing, but thankfully they narrowed it down a little bit.
Yeah. And I think that's when it comes to that difference between helping out people who have too many options and sort of forcing people down a very specific path. In the same way that like sometimes the sort of the interesting dungeon that you had, if that's just over across that hill, if they decide screw it, hop on a boat and head that way, then the next island they have happens to have that dungeon on it. I think that's very different from doing things where you sort of remove that agency from the players, or at least if they can tell that you as a DM are taking that agency away from them. I think that's definitely not great. So we've been talking a lot about being a DM and doing this, but the whole reason that this whole thing started was because I had a player be like, hey, I have a DM that's doing this. How do I tell them? And I think it always comes back to that session 0, like having a good understanding of expectations. But even then, you can only do so much with that. One of the things that I'd like to mention just before we start diving too much into the solutions, one of the things I think that as a player you should look out for when it comes to dealing with railroading is kind of working against the dungeon master, so to speak. I've definitely seen in some situations where players and dungeon masters will get a somewhat adversarial sort of relationship, where it's one of those things where, you know, they're like, how can I beat the dungeon master as a player? And that becomes very difficult for your dungeon master to present to you interesting things if you're being sort of antagonistic the entire time. Now, that being said, if, again, you've established in the beginning of the thing where you're like, hey, DM, we're going to kill anything you send at us, except for that one thing, and we won't tell you what that one thing we're not going to kill is. So...
But as soon as that one thing shows up, we haven't made up our minds yet.
Exactly. So I think that's one of the things, like, as a player, I think, as a dungeon master, what I've run into sometimes with players is when I'm constantly being sort of stymied every time I try to create sort of an interesting scenario with this kind of adversarial relationship, that's when I'm more likely to begin trying to railroad. Now, as a player, if you're realizing that you're being adversarial because you don't like the fact that the DM is railroading, then that comes to that question of how do you approach a dungeon master to be like, hey, yo dog, I didn't like the fact that you stole all the money we spent literally the first 5 months of this campaign getting.
Gosh,
that's a tricky one. I mean, obviously, hopefully you, because I would imagine the tendency to railroad would show it in smaller ways. So it's kind of keeping an eye out for it. So you can kind of say, hey, I didn't like how this went. Because obviously I don't think that a person does a big thing like that. There probably have been although in that case it might be because they were running a pre-published adventure, and at the end of it, it's now doing their own thing, and they might have went, well, I don't want to tell a story where they have all this money.
Yep, I think, and that's actually exactly what it was. Is as soon as the DM was going sort of off book, so to speak, they weren't running the different the modules. It was immediately when the railroading began.
And I love hearing both positive and negative feedback when I'm running. You know, like, oh, that was fun, but this part wasn't as fun for me. You don't have to say like I hated it, but you can kind of go, yeah, I really was looking forward to that, and this doesn't seem interesting to me now, or that kind of thing. Like we had plans for that. How can we get it back? Like you can even give the DM an out. So like in that case with the gold, it's like, is there a way for us to get this treasure back?
Yeah.
You would hope, because like that's a lot of money. Or and as a DM, it'd be kind of fun to like have one of the other groups like go like, oh, we'll help you because we want a cut of that too. And you were the last one to see it. Who was the person that stole it from you?
Yeah.
But it's kind of naughty to taking away, especially a campaign long, like a big adventure like that. The whole purpose of the whole thing under your nose is really brutal. It's that it's one thing if the players decide to sacrifice it. Like you give them the choice, like, having a villain like dangle their loved ones over a pit, give me all the money, or I drop them in the pit, and they have to make a moral choice. And even then you could still maybe try and get it back, that kind of thing. But like, at least there's some choice there. But like that ambush, I
exactly. And like, as a player, sorry, how do you, one of the things that I realized when this whole thing was brought up in the first place was, and we've mentioned this before, but a thing called bleed, where the difference between the game and the player become a little bit more sort of fuzzy. And that's even more so true with being a dungeon master. So much of what you're doing is creating this world, sort of fostering this experience, sort of creating it. So if the players are like, we didn't have fun doing the thing, it can very much feel like they're attacking you as a person, as opposed to being like, hey, could you improve maybe doing this thing? So that was my first thought, is like, how do you like tell someone that their DMing isn't what you're digging without it sounding like, hey, I don't like you or your face?
Right.
Yeah. Like I said, one of the, it's a standard, like, you give a good note and then the bad one, or vice versa. But I mean, honestly, you need to be honest. Like, if you didn't have fun, or that, something happened. I mean, and not always. I mean, sometimes players and DMs are not justified in that. It's like, if they see it personally, it's like, but also as a DM, like, I mean, anytime if you get like a notice like that like, well, I feel like that was unfair. And you have to go, was it unfair? Because like sometimes you don't mean to, you might just seem unfair. And you're like, oh, no, wait, it pays off in one session. Just hold on. Like, if that was being stolen, but in fact, it turns out that it's, it's going to a place that, you're looking forward to seeing, or some other thing, or just as a gateway to get it back. I mean, going on a whole adventure just to get back the thing that you won is pretty harsh.
Yeah. Especially when you didn't get a chance to spend any of it.
Yeah. But that's, I mean, it's obviously like a misstep. You can, I would say it's a misstep, but like I said, it's also learning. Like, you have to understand that while you control everything as the DM, you also can screw everything up. It's real simple. It's not taking into account what your players find fun.
I mentioned before, I had a game where my players were like, we should be firefighters. It was in the world of Changeling. They're like, we should be firefighters, but our engine is a panda, and we feed him bamboo, and that's what drives around our fire engine. We go put out fires and stuff. And I was like, it's the world of darkness. There's a place where people are setting themselves on fire because their souls are so cold. And like, that was massively incongruous. And like, I kept putting them in situations that were very much, they're like, we want to be wacky and do fun stuff. And I was like, it's dark and brooding. And because of that, I was kind of trying to railroad them into a direction that they very much didn't want to go in. And ultimately, it was just like, it was kind of a misstep. And that one was difficult for me because I had to kind of see it. And it took me a good long time before I was like, wait a minute, they're not having fun with this.
Yeah, I know I have it's funny, like, I also have a problem sometimes like that, where I will have players be railroading, like, where I'm like, okay, here's the adventure, and then they're like, yeah, no, we're going to do this other thing. And I'm like, but okay, then here's the adventure here. And they're like, no, we're doing this thing. Where sometimes I'm like, are you guys sure you want to, like, adventure, or are you just, and they're like, yeah, no, we do. And I'm like, oh, okay, all right. Every time you're given a quest, you're just like, no, we're doing this thing.
Yeah, and that could be another thing to remember as a player is like, wanting to do your own thing is awesome, and I think that, you know, having that conversation with your DM, being like, hey, we want to go do this, I think is something that you should definitely do, because as a player you should be having fun playing the game, but you have to also understand that if the session before ended and you guys all plan on going the other place, it's gonna take your DM a minute to, you know, shift gears. Throw the clutch in before you put it into reverse, otherwise you'll destroy your transmission.
I like that phrase. Or I like that.
For an example, oh, sorry, Alex.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, an example in one of mine is I have a couple players in one of my groups that have decided they really want to open a soap shop. And it's like, all right, how do you, and like, it's, you know, I'm like, it's cool. It's a city-based campaign. I'm like, all right, that's interesting. But I want to, like, they're needing to go on a quest, and I was like, so I built into it, like, basically her one of the characters' families wants her to be an adventurer, but she's a bard, and like it was always meant to be the grand adventuring type. So basically, it's kind of holding her inheritance ransom. So that she goes on the adventure now, but it's enough to pay for the soap shop. So it's that, like, okay, so like they're like super excited to go on the quest now because they're gonna have the money for the soap shop at the end of it, and you know, and that kind of thing, and you know, and they're gonna have to find employees and all that fun stuff, which I have to create like a weird, like, I mean, it's its own thing. But
there could be a whole episode where they get to do interviews with crazy people.
They've already started. They're like already considering, like, oh, I wonder if we could hire them. And it's like, yeah. So they actually have a kobold that hangs out with them that they're trying to talk into. Working
they have a kobold that's very, very clean.
Hey, you want to be a cashier?
Yeah, but at the same, like, but that, what's nice about that, and I think something you can do as a player to help if your DM you feel like your DM is kind of railroading, is, and I think you mentioned this before, Jason, is talking about the things that you like and you would like to do more of. Instead of being like, hey, I didn't like that thing you do, be like, hey, this was the thing that I liked that you did. Maybe we do more of that.
And if it's egregious, I highly recommend doing like an intervention where you have the group sit down. Like if you go to the DM and they just kind of, you know, don't see it, or like in the case of like everything being stolen, that's kind of a group moment where you kind of have to be like, yeah, we really don't appreciate that. Like you have to level heads, you know, but like something that like drastic, you might need to, you know, like we sit down and be like, how is this campaign going forward? Because we didn't like that at all.
Well, and as a player, it's okay for you to be like, hey, can we have a sort of mid-campaign session 0, so to speak, and have that that kind of like, and I mean maybe getting together not during the session is kind of hard, but yeah. And, you know, just be like, hey, you know, this is where our expectations are. This is kind of the things that we liked so far that you've done. And again, as a player, remembering that essentially what you're doing is you're saying that the thing that person has been doing you don't like. So they may not take that very well. But at the same time, it's so much better to be like, hey, maybe we could do something different than to just slowly not have fun until your relationship ends up getting sort of pear-shaped. I think actually Vaughn had that. We had that conversation. Vaughn mentioned that he had a group that had sort of just, it went on for too long, and then eventually their friendship suffered sort of through it.
Yeah.
Another thing you just brought up that I think it could be interesting is you don't just have to have a session 0. You know, after a major adventure or something, it might be a good idea to be like, you know, we made it through the Water Dream Dragon heist and we have all this money. Let's have a session, you know, 0.1 where we discuss like where we kind of want to go with this. Yeah. Like, you know, do we want to sit around and figure out how we spend the money? Or do we just kind of want to buy a bunch of crap and go further adventuring?
Yeah.
You know, or whatever. Or, you know, we're not interested in the money. It was just more fun to play through the adventure or whatever it is, you know.
Yeah.
You can spitball some ideas of what would be fun moving on. Especially after a big game-changing thing like the Waterdeep Dragon heist, where that's hugely changing to a campaign. A lot of treasure, a dragon's hoard or something completely changes the game.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And
at those points, I think it's a good idea to like to talk everybody to talk it through. I mean, you know, and just be like, you know, what did you like? What didn't you like? I mean, performance review should be, you know, a good thing for a DM.
Yeah.
How many Yelp reviews do you get as a DM?
Yeah. And I think also, as a DM, going back to that side, if your players come to you and be like, hey, we didn't really like the things you do, that's not an attack against you. Like,
mentioning feedback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead,
well, as a DM, you're always learning too. Like, there's a lot of times where I'd be like, well, something I did, a year ago or in a past adventure, I'd be like, oh, I would have never done that now. Like, I didn't really give them as much of a choice as I should have, or whatever it is. But like, you're always learning. You learn a lot from your players if you're paying attention, because sometimes you're learning of dealing with problem players, but that's still something. Like dealing with the murder hobos, you're kind of learning, like, okay, how do I make this fun for, if everybody's having fun during the murder hobo thing, it's kind of fine.
Yeah.
Unless you find it absolutely unfulfilling and it's driving you crazy, then you kind of need to talk to your players. But
stop killing everybody.
Yeah.
Please stop killing everyone.
Well, that's when you start making cannon fodder, Cannon McFodder. He's just the guy who walks up and talks to the characters. He's going to die. Like, or do the recurring joke where it's just one family that keeps talking to them, and he just like eliminated everybody.
Sure, exposition.
You could do the thing with like the intellect hours, where they're perfectly benign as long as they're alive, but as soon as they die, then their skeleton pops up and starts murdering things. So as long as they're alive, the skeleton can't escape their meat prison.
Do like a reverse murder hobo, where like the murder hobo murders somebody and then I murder them. Oh, nice.
And it gives them that fun thing of like, we can kill them, but then we have to deal with their skeleton. Actually, now I really kind of enjoy that as a concept. Every time you kill someone, they pop up as an undead. You're like, ah.
You gotta make sure that it fits, but that concept could definitely go far.
Yeah, I had a necromancer who would commonly give that threat. It's like just threatened to take the bones from their body to join his army. He's like, I'm using them. No.
The idea of a living person being a meat prison for a skeleton horror is great.
Oh God, I feel dirty.
Yeah. As soon as this muscle is gone from me, I will murder. But yeah, so let's see. I'm checking the old notes of anything that we.
I think we've gone through.
Well, we were talking about. We mentioned a while ago, but the whole cutscene thing.
Yes.
And like I said, cutscenes can go on too long, and if you catch yourself doing them, that's can be a good sign of railroading. But there's one I commonly do more is the yada yada thing, where you're like, if they say they're traveling overland and you don't want to deal with encounters on that way, then you can give like the long description of the trip. I always find that necessary to impact, like, you didn't just get on a bus and go across town.
You didn't teleport away. Yeah.
I usually, but so I know that that's a form of cutscene, quote unquote, but I mean, as long as it's the player's choice to go in that direction, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
I think cutscenes are particularly bad when you are giving, especially mid-campaign, giving a mission. If you just kind of go, and the king says you are doing this, that, and the other, and you will get this much gold, and go.
Oh, another thing as a DM to always remember is like, you don't get to decide how a player reacts to a thing. So like you watch as, again, going back to the meat prison thing, you watch as the person falls to the ground, their muscles being ripped and torn as their skeleton bursts free, and you suddenly feel a great sense of dread and terror. The character might not feel a sense of great dread and terror. They might think to themselves, yes, a second fight! Or like, why would this do this? Intrigue and interest. And I find that's actually one of the ones that I think is the most, where I'm just like, you find yourself in horror as this thing happens. And I'm like, no, they feel how they want to feel. I just describe the things that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that one. It can be tricky because you're trying to bring to mind the scene,
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, I had a thought and it's gone. Yeah.
Oh, it's like the show don't tell thing in writing and movies and things. Kind of a similar principle in I think in in DMing is it's so much more impactful to have the players be the things that are interacting with the other stuff, as opposed to you through the players interacting with other things. It's a little
You do have to be careful though when you do go into the cool descriptions that you don't have that you be mindful of the players that as soon as you do describe the walls leaking with a liquid, that they don't go lick the wall. I have definitely tried to speak with the players, just being like, guys, I'm still describing the room, okay? Sure, you see a dude over there, and then they're like, I want to talk to the dude. And I'm like, there's chairs in the way. I'm going to go talk to the dude. But okay, fine, you trip over the chairs. Good job. You make yourself look silly.
It's funny because like a good example of like setting up, especially in like a one shot or a very time constrained game, setting up that kind of cutscene thing, that can eat some time. I actually ran for a bunch of new players, and in it, I was surprised. I introduced a mayor who was asking them to protect the town, and I described him with this big feathered hat, and he was just the important guy, and he just came in explaining like, "Oh, I need your help," and he was like kind of under his breath, he's a total politician, and I just explained how die rolls worked, and he used persuasion to try and influence people and stuff, and like the deal was for X amount of gold pieces, and he's like, oh, I want to negotiate with him. And one of the players, this is like a 13-year-old, and I look over at him and I'm like, well, what are you gonna, do you want to get more money? And he's like, I want him to throw in his hat. And I just kind of went, it was just one of those like, it was a person who never played before, and I'm like, you just got the essence of D&D down right there. Yeah. That was just like that moment. But like allowing the players to interact with that cutscene, quote unquote cutscene, like that they could, try and get better, they could have said no if they wanted to. Yeah. I would have to deal with that, but and obviously like a one shot is way trickier.
I was gonna say, you bring up an excellent point, because one shots are their own sort of strange amorphous thing, where like when you have that very specific restraint, and sorry, for those of you who are not sure what this one shot thing is, it's essentially you have a single session that has a beginning, middle, and end. And unfortunately, in situations like that, pacing is very, very important, because in a lot of situations, if you're having a one-shot, that means that you can't do a follow-up. And if you don't get to the end, you just don't get to the end. And so the one situation I think where railroading becomes significantly more prevalent and a lot more acceptable is in a one-shot. Where you have those story beats that you sort of need to hit to be able to create a sort of fulfilled and interesting sort of thing. Now, as a DM, that means that you have to know where you can sort of let things kind of slide and let things kind of move around, and where you need to sort of yada yada your way through some things. I think, Jason, you mentioned a very similar sort of like negotiating situation where you had the one shot and there was a lot of other stuff, and you happened to let them negotiate, and that took up a chunk.
Yeah, they started asking for like, can I get some water? I think I was like, oh, yeah, sure. And like it kept going down road of asking for other things. That had nothing to do with the thing. And I realized that especially it was a really limited time. It was a 2-hour session, and so I ended up skipping a portion of the later thing. Luckily I made the adventure modular enough that like there could have been scenes that were skipped, but the other thing was that I realized that there's nothing against in a one shot starting in media res or in middle of things.
Yeah.
So like usually also in a one shot, it's pre-made characters. So there's no reason why it can't be in the middle of a war or, already halfway through the dungeon.
Yeah.
You've awoken from a long rest and, you only vaguely remember what happened before. Like, where are we? Who are you? That kind of,
Now I like the idea of the amnesia dungeon. I like this plan.
Yeah, or the backwards dungeon where you're trying to get back out. You've already got the treasure. You got to try and
freedom, please. Out.
Yeah. There's so many different. But the idea of starting in the middle of things, I think, is a lot of fun because you can kind of, just it also like you can start with an action beat too. You don't have to explain right away what's going on. You're just like, all right, you wake up and, you suddenly you come to and there's, something,
roll initiative, quick.
Oh gosh, oh God, roll initiative.
Yep.
So there's an angry goblin poking you in the nose,
Yeah.
He keeps saying, boop,
being like, what are you doing here, or something.
Yeah. Well, and so it's funny. One of the other things that I found very fascinating while thinking about this particular topic to talk about is realizing that on multiple occasions we've mentioned sort of the subverted agency sort of behind the scenes kind of thing. Like there's been definitely a couple times where I've just, the idea of the well planned dungeon being sort of scooped up and placed somewhere else because I'm like, I spent all this time on this stupid thing and I don't have anything else prepared. So sure, it was supposed to be this way, but it's this way now. I mean, obviously, I try to always give the players as much ability to make those decisions as possible. And sometimes you do need to just be like, hey, so I wasn't ready for you guys to do this, so you're gonna have to wait while I figure some stuff out. So go to the bathroom, get a drink, be back in a bit.
I was about to say, like, one of my favorite tricks when players just completely throw me off the rail, and I'm just like, I need to use the restroom real fast, guys. And then I am just like hurriedly planning while sitting and just being like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? What am I doing?
Yeah.
Scrolling through my phone right.
Yeah. Another tip is to not overly plan. So like the more you plan out, like this will happen and this will happen and this will happen. If you have just kind of plot events or things that'll happen, but they're kind of vague, you want to give them the hint to go in that direction, but you always be aware that they may not take that bait, or they may not, they may not question the prisoners or ever find out that information. Well, of course, you can always be like, well, okay, if you think of that beforehand, they might kill everybody. Does one of them have a note in their pocket, or some kind of like, magic gemstone that'll give a message, that kind of thing. That typically works better than a note because players are almost always looking for gold and money in pockets. So
yeah. Well, I think actually you mentioned this before. In thinking of, ironically, thinking of how events would transpire were the players not to interact with it, can I think make it easier sometimes to not railroad? Kind of. That makes it much easier for inaction. If you have like very specific things that are going to be happening when the players don't interact with it, and then they do interact, it becomes a little bit more muddled. But just keeping in mind that NPCs will do if the players don't stop them from doing things.
Yeah. So a good example of that is in one of the campaigns. There was this campaign where everybody's playing villains. They're kind of up against other villains. I have another group, and they're not together. They don't work. The other group doesn't work together. But the players get to choose who they go after, and directly affecting is like if they can take out this guy, then like I know what the NPCs are planning and are trying to do. So if they move to another random town and destroy the thing that would have empowered the other character, that will it'll throw everything off. And it's completely open world for where they go, but what they choose to do and choose not to do has really direct ramifications because there's specific characters that will, and they're going to change their plans if they get wind of what the players are doing and stuff to an extent. That kind of thing.
They're still pre-programmed to do something.
Yeah. But that's go ahead.
Yeah. One of my big campaigns that I'm having a lot of fun with. Literally the whole thing is designed to there are too many tasks for the players to be able to succeed to do them all, and what sort of drives the narrative forward is what things they don't do. So like they've got these 4 sort of major events that exist in the world, and they have a choice of like sort of what order they do things in, and because they have a very specific, like they can't do everything, that sort of helps propel forward what the thing is. So I always know that it's going to be one of these sort of 4 options, and they get to decide which one it is through their inaction, which is a delightfully fun way of doing it. Do we have any sort of final thoughts before we wrap up for today?
Listen to your players. Listen to DMs. Definitely state how you feel.
Yes,
it's super helpful.
So as a quick thing, I don't know if this has been mentioned before, but Adventures League is actually doing in-person sessions at Zulu's again. For those of you who don't know about Adventures League is organized D&D play where you can get together, you have your character with a handful of sort of parameters for making it, and you can have that character move from DM to DM through the thing. I believe they're using Warhorn.net.
Yes, Warhorn.net.
For sign up? Yep.
And it's Wizard of the Coast sanctioned. You can take those characters to any other event that's playing.
So in the case that we ever have conventions again, you can take that character and play it. But yeah, they're meeting on Mondays, I believe.
Mondays.
Yep. So if you're interested in that,
all the information, and that's where you sign up. I know that we have fewer tables than we normally do,
but the construction is coming along delightfully.
Yes. Well, right? I mean, because of the we still are under some restrictions. So
yes,
but it is it was crazy on Sunday night. We had a Magic event, and it was packed, and it's nice to see people at Zulu's again.
It really is. Also, sorry, second.
Oh, it's good to see people in person again.
Yeah. We're also continuing to expand our offerings. If you're interested in having hosted D&D games, one of the three of us running your game, and Vaughn running the game for you, you can absolutely do that. There's a fee that is associated with that, whereas Adventures League is a free sort of thing. There's pros and cons to both. We'll worry about that later. But if that's something you're interested in, you can go to our email down there. It is zulusdnd@gmail.com. Or you can go to Zulu's Games and go to the D&D sessions, I think it's called.
Yep, it's D&D sessions. And then you will have to scroll down past our most popular item of the Young Adventurers. But you can sign up for either weekly adventures, or you can sign up for a D&D one-shot, or just like...
We do birthdays, or just parties.
Birthdays, parties, get-togethers. I don't know what else do people do.
Learn to play. Actually, it's one of the best ways to learn to play is by doing. So you can come in with zero knowledge. I have had multiple occasions. Jason, Alex, I know both of you guys have as well. Players will show up with hope in their heart and nothing else, and by the end of it, a couple hours later, they have gone through an adventure and hopefully have a better understanding of the rules. So yeah, that is an option as well. I think
they'll be tired for the rest of the day because their mind is expanding, learning Dungeons and Dragons.
That's true. And we do also do more than Dungeons and Dragons. I'm significantly more confident with the West End Star Wars games. There's Fate. There's some of the other ones. That one's maybe not one that we'll dive directly into. Most of us are significantly more confident with D&D, but Jason, I know you know a lot of systems.
So if anyone's asking for any far out system, we'll send them your way, Jason.
Yeah, I read random role playing games in my off time and love to run them. So,
what was the Morkborg, the yellow one from Sweden?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that one looks delightful. So, all right, well, stay safe out there, everyone. It was delightful talking to you, Jason and Alex, as always, and I will see you guys next week for more discussions. We'll figure out what that is as we go. We'll probably try to do a post so you know what we're doing as we get closer to it. But until then, stay safe and have fun gaming.
Bye.